All right, good afternoon, everyone that has just joined. We are just about to start in a minute or two our Becoming a Confident Writer webinar. Once again, I want to remind everyone of some housekeeping before we get started. This is the third of our Fall 2022 Student Success webinar series. There are two more coming up in the coming weeks. Registration information for those will be sent out in a follow-up email, as well as a recording of this session for those who are not able to stay for the full duration of the session. At the end, we'll have a Q&A, so make sure you are jotting down your questions, or you also have a question box attached to your control panel that you can drop those questions in. I may be able to answer some of them as we go, but most of them we're going to save for the end of the presentation, and we'll address them then. So with that, I would like to introduce Dr. Amy Dietzman, who is our Senior Director of Learning Strategies and Professional Development here at Tutor.com. She will be sharing her expertise with you all today, and we'll be going over topics like analyzing writing assignment instructions, finding and properly utilizing scholarly resources, scrutinizing a rubric to get the best grade possible, and applying instructor feedback to become a better writer. So without any further ado, I'm super excited to get started. And so we will pass it along to Amy.
Awesome. Hi, everybody. Thanks, Jess. All right, we're going to talk about becoming a confident writer. This is one of the nearest and dearest subjects to my heart. I know that sounds weird, but writing, I just love it. I love teaching writing, and I love talking about writing. I love writing. So today we're going to discuss, just like Jess said, some ways that you can become a better writer. We're going to identify how you decode assignment directions so you can get right to what your instructor is asking of you. We're going to explore the significance of writing rubrics and how you can use them to get better grades. And since writing and academic integrity go hand in hand, we're going to talk a little bit about how to avoid plagiarism. Before we talk about writing, we need to start with reading. Reading makes you a better writer. William Faulkner said, "Read everything, trash, classics, good and bad, and see how they do it. Just like a carpenter who works as an apprentice and studies the master, read." Solid writing isn't just about writing papers. We use writing for everything these days. We send emails, we fire off text messages. So I'm going to show you a text message that actually came from my own phone. And it says, "Good morning, Amy. Hope you're doing well. Designed by, do you guys know I will text you this afternoon when I am heading your way because I was sheriff. Should be after 4 when I will get there today, but I will text you and let you know." I even had a hard time reading that out loud. Well, he might be with the sheriff, and that's why he's coming after 4. He will text me and let me know. Okay. So now this is a simple case of firing off a text without proofing it. And we all do this. But I will be honest with you, this guy sent texts like this to me numerous times. So what does it say about him? People with strong writing skills are perceived as more reliable and trustworthy. Honing in on this skill set will not only help you in your current job, but will help you move up the corporate ladder. A study by Grammarly noted that those with fewer grammatical errors in their writing correlated to more promotions and higher salaries. So writing is really important. We know that writing takes us farther in our careers. Solid writing also helps us to get along with others better. When you consider that so many companies have gone remote, or at least have some remote options, a great deal of communication has shifted from face-to-face to online. We rely heavily on email, text, instant messenger, and in a matter of seconds, your short email or your IM exchange can either charm someone or turn someone off completely. And this can be done very well by mistake. Writing in school is so much more prevalent than it used to be. With the online classroom, discussions that would often take place face-to-face are now taking place in forums, and our instructors are grading us on them. Almost every class has a writing component or a research paper. And years ago, this was not always the norm. But writing effectively will take you farther in school and in your career. So how can we become more confident in our writing? After all, that's what we're here to learn. To become a better writer, first off is you want to expand your vocabulary. Spend time wordsmithing. Find words that better express what you're trying to convey. But be careful with the thesaurus. I've read many papers where I can tell that the student just went crazy with that thesaurus and the sentences no longer make any sense. You have to know the parts of speech for the words that you're looking to replace. So of course, replace an adjective with an adjective and a verb with a verb. And one suggestion is you can just look through your paper and see if you have some favorite words, words that you just use over and over again because they're just in your brain and they come out more easily. And if so, what you want to try to do is replace those with something else because it helps the flow of your paper. When I was writing my dissertation, I had to describe other researchers' work a lot. So I might say, so-and-so said this, or so-and-so wrote that. Well, said and wrote are super boring words. So I made a list of better verbs to use in those situations. And then when I was writing, I would just look down at my list, which was on a sticky note, and I would find a better verb and plug it in. When it comes to increasing your writing brain and abilities, it's not always best to go with what's easy. If easy doesn't inspire you in some way, then you're going to struggle to write the paper. It's better to choose a topic that you care about. Choose topics that are connected to your skills, your interests, your future, people that you know, or just topics that challenge you, but in a good way. Because research and writing can be enjoyable if you have a passion for it. So let's get into it. You get an assignment. You read through the prompt and you're immediately overwhelmed. Well, now it's time to break it down. The first thing to do is break it apart. Ask yourself these questions. What's the most important point here? What is the purpose of this assignment? Is my purpose to provide information without forming an argument? Is it to construct an argument based on research? Am I analyzing a poem and I'm discussing its imagery? And then who is my audience? Is my instructor the only one reading this paper? Who else might read it? Will it be posted online? What are my readers' needs and expectations? Then go back, and break each section of the prompt apart. So a lot of times instructors will say something like, write a paper and address the following things. And then they'll list them out in bullet points. It's important to make sure that they aren't asking for two things in each bullet, because sometimes in our haste to get started, like, oh, I'm overwhelmed, so I'm just going to jump in, we miss that they are asking us to do 6 things instead of just 4. So I'm a color coder. So I would color code each thing they were asking me to do in the prompt. And then I'd number them in a way that made the most sense to me. You don't always have to write your paper in the order that the instructor gives it to you. So I would use those color-coded notes, those color codes as I wrote, just to ensure that I didn't forget anything once I started. It's easy to do that. So just remember, keep assignment directions close. Consider printing them, using highlighters, and keeping those directions next to you as you form your paper, always referring back to them. Action words are very important in an assignment. It's a good idea to circle all the action words in a writing prompt so you get a clear understanding of what's being asked. Each of these words on the screen right now requires a different kind of essay. In particular, these words limit the scope of your essay, and that's good. You want the scope to be limited, it's easier. So if you're asked to summarize something, well, that's not the same as analyzing something. Summarizing is just putting something into your own words. Analyzing is deeper than that. It's interpreting and examining evidence, and it requires a more in-depth explanation. So you want to make sure you don't summarize something when you should have been analyzing it. If you don't know what you're being asked to do, then use your resources. talk to your tutor or a librarian. A tutor can help you decode the directions and clarify the assignment. It's always best to clarify rather than spend hours spinning your wheels and feeling unconfident about what you're doing and just getting nowhere. So much better to stop and see if someone can help you figure it out. So let's look at some action word examples. A compare and contrast essay is much different than just discussing two things. This is a mistake a lot of my students made, because what they would do is they would just explain one thing and then explain the other thing. But a compare and contrast essay is about indicating how the two things are the same and then how the two things are different. In addition, comparing is not forming an argument. If you're asked to compare the politics of Ronald Reagan and Barack Obama, you will not be taking a position about whose politics you prefer. Comparing is not the same as forming an argument or an opinion. If you are asked to describe something, like describe the use of humor in Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, well, you are not critiquing the work overall, you're just describing it. And if you are asked to summarize the findings of multiple scientific research papers, you are not presenting your own findings. So what action words tell you in a prompt is how you actually approach your subject. Once you know that much, you've identified what the assignment is asking of you and what you're going to write and what evidence you might be using in your essay, well, then you need to organize your essay by preparing your outline. An outline is never the most exciting part of the writing process, and a lot of people want to skip it because they don't think they have time, right? So I got to get this done. I don't have time to sit down and do an essay. But it is key to making sure that you know what you're going to say in your essay before you start writing it. All the best outlines are very simple. Just think of it as a roadmap. If you have no roadmap, how do you know where you're going? So always start with your introduction. The main element of your introduction is your thesis statement. However, your introduction should not only be your thesis statement. The best essays always begin with a hook, something small that grabs the reader's attention and pulls them in. You do not need to write your hook in your outline, but have an idea and maybe just make note of it. Remember that this is a hook, not the whole fishing rod. You will reel your reader to agree with your argument throughout the rest of your essay. Then the all-important thesis statement. It's one of the hardest things to write. And sometimes that thesis statement does not reveal itself to you until you have all the body paragraphs fleshed out. So don't feel like you actually have to start with the introduction. I rarely wrote my introduction first. Just a little tip. Next, you'll build out your 3 body paragraphs or however many body paragraphs. So to better show you how these should look, we're just going to talk about one. But you should repeat the same process for each body paragraph. First, you want to write out the main idea of your paragraph. Think of this as your mini thesis just for that paragraph. Then list at least 3 pieces of evidence that you have found that support your main idea. These can be references that only you understand. No one else is going to look at your outline unless you're required to turn it in. That happens sometimes. As long as you're sure that you can reference this stuff later, you know what evidence you were talking about. You also don't always need 3 pieces of evidence in every single paragraph. Maybe you'll have more, maybe you'll have less, but if you lean towards having 3, then you're more likely to have enough evidence to make your point. And after you outline your introduction and your body paragraphs, you should outline your conclusion. In the conclusion, you will restate your thesis, but there should be a slight revision here with perhaps more emphasis at the end. Your thesis is still the key to your essay, and it needs to be brought up in the conclusion to tie it all together with a little bow. Then take 1 sentence to summarize every one of your body paragraphs. You don't need to do that in your outline, but just write down a brief summary as a note to yourself. So I've said all this, and I know what a lot of you are thinking. Well, this is the pretty simple, straightforward 5-paragraph essay that I learned in 4th grade. This seems like the basic thing I've always been taught. And that's true, and there's good reason for that. What you've always been taught as a structure to write is a fantastic basic structure for an essay. If you get more comfortable and confident, as we're talking about, maybe your 3 ideas are going to move into multiple paragraphs for each idea. This is just a beginning. This is not the very best version of an essay that's ever possible, but it's a guarantee to at least make your essay work. So let's talk about some steps for better writing. First of all, don't rush. Writing is a process. It takes time, consideration, planning, and revising. And this goes hand in hand with avoiding procrastination. You sell this process short if you don't give yourself time to go through the writing process. It's a process. And if you put it off until the last minute, you don't have that. As I've said many times, procrastinators get lower grades than those who do the work ahead of time. It is a fact, researched fact. Sometimes just a little tip, what I would do is I would read a prompt, think through all the steps. Maybe I'd make my outline. Maybe I'd sit down and Google and go through the library and do all my research. And then I didn't even write anything during that session. Sometimes I found that if I researched and then went for a walk or did something else, I could use that time to process and form the argument I wanted to make in my head. Then I'd write at another time. Revise. If you really crank out the text and experiment and just let things flow, you'll need to go back over it. Many writers hate revising because it seems like so much work when they've already done the writing. But if you want to be a good writer, you need to learn to revise, because revision is where the good writing really is. It separates the mediocre from the great. Go back over everything, looking not only for grammar and spelling mistakes, but for unnecessary words, awkward structures, confusing sentences. Aim for clarity, for strength, and for freshness. In your revision process, you should also read it out loud. Hearing it and hearing where you pause, where you trip up, where you need to take a breath will help you edit more effectively. Think about that silly text message I just read to you. I could hardly get through it because there was no punctuation. So where did I pause? Well, I didn't. So if you read that out loud, or if that guy had read it out loud, maybe he would have caught those mistakes. And then start and end strong. The most important parts of your writing are the beginning and the end. The beginning sets the roadmap for your paper, helps both you and your reader with expectations. Remember that you're writing this for an audience. If your reader is confused at the beginning, you're going to have a problem. The end is the last thing that the instructor reads before they give you a grade. So it's really important. Also, well, spell and grammar check. Don't forget to do this. Grammar check often catches words that are spelled correctly, but also incorrectly. So, you know those words that have 2 or 3 spellings, but they mean different things, like there, and there, or cite with a C and then cite with an S. Students make these mistakes a lot, and the spell check is not going to find that because the word's spelled correctly, but the grammar check will. So that's important. And then lastly, you want to check the rubric. This is often a misstep of being a good academic writer, but we're going to come back to more about the rubric in just a minute. I want to go to one more thing first, and that's the little things. Let's talk about all the little things that you can do that might make your writing unclear. If you hear any of these and you think, oh, I do that, well, then all I have to say to you is, of course you do. These are writing problems even professional writers have. For your academic essays, you need to make sure you are clearly articulating your thesis throughout your essay. To clearly articulate anything, you have to pay attention to little things. So you want to avoid redundancies, which is not just saying the same thing over and over again, but saying the same thing in different ways too. Try to mix things up, show your range, and be especially wary of repetition in the conclusion of your essay. It's an area where a lot of students make mistakes. I noticed that they just take the first paragraph and almost copy paste it again. I hate that. You can also make sure that you're focusing on the word choice, not just how many words you're using, because there's a difference between use and utilize. or build and fabricate, or think and realize. Choosing the correct word makes your writing stronger. You also need to always watch out when using pronouns. If you are writing about 3 women talking and keep saying, she did this, but she did that, your reader's going to have a tough time knowing who is doing what. Make sure it is clear who your pronouns refer to when you're using one. You also want to reduce wordiness. We all want to sound smart, and we think that using more words makes us sound smart. Usually it just makes it confusing. Eliminate as much of the fluff as possible from your essay, unless you're writing some, beautiful literature or something. Be concise, get to your point, and make it clearly. You must also make sure that you are using the correct word tense throughout your essay. Many students shift between present tense, and then they talk about the past tense, and then they talk about what's going to happen in the future, all within one sentence or one paragraph. And this gets extremely confusing for the reader. Always make sure that all of your word tenses are in agreement with each other. Usually, as a word of thumb, if you're not sure, it's best to write in the past tense for history and research, but the key objective is just always shoot for clarity. And finally, watch your sentence structure, especially when you've gone through many changes and edits. Some parts of sentences get left standing apart from where they were first written. If you do a lot of copy paste, cut paste, move it over here, cut over here, paste it, you can be left with really weird, odd fragments or run-on sentences that you just don't catch at first because you're so familiar with your own writing, especially if you've been living in a paper for, hours. You're looking at it and it's like, I don't even know what I've written. So that's why reading it out loud should be part of the process. So now let's talk about rubrics a little bit. Instructors use rubrics to grade. If they're going to have this thing in front of them while giving you your grade, don't you want to review it really closely too? Because it lists everything that will be graded, and sometimes directions alone miss things. So what I mean by that is it's a small mistake that a lot of instructors make. I'm not saying any of your instructors make this, but it happens. And that's called hidden curriculum. It's when the instructions say one thing, and then the rubric says something just a little bit different. So now you're like, which one should I follow? Well, the rubric is the one that they're using to grade. So for an example, let me give you an example. The rubric may tell you to use 5 or 6 pieces of evidence from at least 3 different sources. The assignment might have just said, like the directions might have just said, you should use some evidence to support your claims. So you might think, well, okay, I only have to use 2 pieces of evidence or something like that. I don't know. But the rubric said 5 to 6 pieces of evidence from 3 different sources. See how specific that is? Once you've read the rubric, now you know exactly what's expected. And if you hadn't read the rubric, you probably would have lost a lot of points on that assignment. So once you've read a rubric, ensured your paper meets the criteria, you can confidently submit your assignment knowing you've done your best work. So this is a key to being confident. A great way to look at a rubric is like this one. I love this rubric, and I wish that all rubrics looked like this, but they don't. So see how the top row is laid out? There's a column for an A paper, a B paper, and so on. So if you're interested in getting an F, you would just look at the last column. But I know a lot of students who are just going to give it half a shot. They're fine with a B or C. Does that mean that they should look at the C paper column and just try to do those things, middle of the road, meet most of the requirements? No, that's not the way to go, because you might think you've met the requirements, but your instructor may think you haven't. And now you thought you were going for a C, but you're flirting with a D. Your best bet is to pretty much ignore the entire rubric except for the A column. That's where you're striving for. It doesn't mean you'll get it, but it does at least mean that you're including all the necessary criteria and then some. In most rubrics, this will say something like excellent or excelling or exceeds expectations. This doesn't mean that you've written a really good paper. It means you've written better than the expectations. So how do you close read a rubric like this? My advice is, again, to print it out. Print a copy of the assignment directions, which I already told you to do in color code. Put them side by side with the rubric and note if anything looks different. So you're looking for that hidden curriculum. If you notice something more specific in the rubric than in the directions, highlight it or copy it over to your directions. You want to look for any verbs or anything that's telling you specifically what to include in your assignment. Remember how we were talking about those action words? So let me show you how I would read this rubric. Look at the A paper box, okay? What I would do is if there's anything in this box that I'm unsure about, I have a concern or a question, or I want to make sure I come back and check it again, I would underline that. Okay, then maybe that's an area where I need tutoring. Maybe that's a question I have for the instructor. And then another thing, so I'm going to circle the words that are my action words, and I'm going to underline the things I don't understand. Another thing to consider is that usually each of these columns is a range. If you get into the A column, that could be a 93%, it could be a 95%. It doesn't always mean 100%. So more than once I've had students inquire, like, how did I get all of the stuff in the first column, but I didn't get 100%? Remember that, and I've said this before, some instructors, including me, reserve 100% for perfection, and a perfect paper is rarely achieved. So know that it's a range generally, 90 to 100, 80 to 90, that kind of thing. So I used this slide in my first confidence webinar a few weeks ago, but I just want to address it one more time. Get feedback as early as you can in your classes, and then apply that feedback before you submit another paper, so you don't make the same mistakes twice. Don't take instructor feedback personally. See it as a way to help you grow and become a better writer, a stronger student, a smarter student. And don't expect perfection. Like I just said, so many of us think that any feedback means we're not doing a good job. But feedback just means you have room to grow. If you didn't have room to grow, you wouldn't be a student. You would not be in school. So expect that you're doing the best you can, and you're going to improve in every paper you write. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about plagiarism. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention it, because you're never going to be a good writer if you don't write your own stuff. You're never going to have the satisfaction of learning or the gaining of confidence from submitting your own work if you submit someone else's. Plagiarism is the easy way out, and at least 40% of students admit to cheating on written assignments. And those are the ones who know they're doing it and admit to it. Those are deliberate plagiarizers. Deliberate plagiarizing is knowing that you're copying and pasting something from a source and not citing it, or buying a paper online, something like that. But there's another thing called accidental plagiarism, and this is much more common. This is when you just don't take good notes. You don't remember that you read something somewhere and then you put it into your paper. And this comes from being disorganized in your research process. But don't let fear of plagiarism paralyze you. Just think of it this way. You're doing your best to be honest. So let me give you an example. If someone told you a really good story and you were really into it, it was so good, and you wanted to make sure you remembered it because you want to go tell someone else this story later, you'd listen really intently. You'd commit that to your memory, and then you'd hold on to it as best as you could, so you could do it justice when you told someone else later, right? This is the same principle. You're taking in really good information when you're doing research, and you're respecting that information and the writer. You want to make sure you give credit to that person who shared it with you. So that's all you have to worry about. If you're doing that, you're probably going to be just fine. Let's talk a little bit more about academic integrity. When you sit down to research and write, you need to be very methodical about how you take notes. Document the articles you read and gather ideas from them. You have to find your own system Everybody has different note-taking systems, but a well-defined system will help you with your confidence. It's also going to keep you from thinking, oh, shoot, did I just plagiarize? There's no better feeling. Well, in my opinion, because I'm a total nerd, but there's no better feeling than getting a topic for an assignment, having really no clue what you want to write about, beginning the research process, and then very clearly having your paper come into focus, beginning to form a clear argument, reading articles that support your thoughts, and then click. I know what I'm going to write, and it's going to be so good. That's a great feeling. That comes in this process. Something that I've often seen that we also want to talk about quickly is a reference page with 6 articles listed and only 3 of them are actually cited in the paper. I've also read long dissertation proposals where citations exist in the document, but then there's no matching reference on the reference page. So take time to make sure that you're checking and rechecking, because that can also be considered plagiarism. You want to make sure that every citation has a matching reference on the reference page. I'm almost done, just a few more slides. I'm just going to quickly talk about research. Most papers that you write in high school or in college, wherever you are, grad school, whatever, are research papers. They may not be labeled as such, but if you have to find any evidence for your paper, then that's research. So the first step is to search. Googling, going through the library, finding books or videos, right? We're all pretty good at Googling these days. And then note-taking, taking what you found in your search, assimilating it, and figuring out how to incorporate it into your topic and into the argument of your paper. The next step is outlining and writing, which we talked about. Writing is much more than copy-paste. It takes critical thinking, deep concentration. As you write, you begin to back up your own thoughts with the thoughts and research of the experts. This is where you have citations and you start giving credit, citing and formulating your reference page, and then revising. We talked about this already too. So many writers skip it because they're tired. They run out of time. They're sick of thinking about this darn paper. Schedule time for revision, and your best revision session is one with a fresh brain. So it's really good to write one day and then revise the next day, or write one morning, take the whole day to do something else, and then come back with fresh eyes and revise that night or something like that. So you have to give yourself time. Make sure you're scheduling this out. In a couple of weeks, I'm doing another webinar on critical thinking and research skills, where I'm going to go into more depth on this. So here's a brief overview of finding credible sources. Many libraries, schools, and universities have electronic databases. Look for a database link on your local library or your school's website. And you want to check out things like ProQuest or ERIC for scholarly articles. And also Google Scholar is great. Use primary sources, meaning the original document and not someone else's summary of that. It's better to quote the original author rather than someone else who's quoting the original author. So think of it as like a game of telephone. The more people who take what someone said, the better chance they're going to interpret that in their own way. So pretty soon, as you go down the line, it's not really at all what the original person said. So try to find that original source. Also, look at the domain suffix. That means if it's a .edu, a .gov, or a .org, those are generally more reliable sources. You want to be aware of political sites. You also want to be aware of things that end in .com, because those are companies, so they have an agenda, or professional organizations that end in .org. Sometimes you have to use those with caution also, because they might be promoting something. Over the years, Wikipedia has become more and more reliable. I remember when Wikipedia was the wild, wild west and nobody wanted you to use it, but it is a great starting point. And if you start with Wikipedia, there's another thing you can do with it, and that's use the references section of each Wikipedia entry. So you find a Wikipedia entry on your topic, scroll all the way down to the bottom of that page, and there you're going to find a list of resources. And usually there's links, so you can just link right to the resources. And that's a good place to start as well. This is true of any resource. If you ever read a really good article, go to the references page and see if you can find additional articles from that article. Use the titles, the journal titles, or the author, and search for those in your online library or in Google Scholar. I learned that later in life, and it was so awesome. Check the dates of your source. If you're citing something that's more than 5 or 10 years old, it's probably no longer credible. More research has likely been done. The world has changed. Issues have changed. I've noticed that lately, like if I research something where there's statistics on colleges and universities from 2018, well, something happened since 2018 called the pandemic. So that research is probably not that accurate anymore. Now, there is a time when this is not applicable, and that's when you're citing primary sources on historical events, because those don't change. So those dates are okay if they're older, but most research should be within the last 5 or 10 years. Examine the author's credentials. If you're not sure whether the author is a credible source, look them up, Google them, see what they do, and go with your instincts. So again, I'm conducting a webinar on this, critical thinking and research skills. It's November 3rd, and I'm going to go more in depth about how to research and take good notes when you're writing a paper. So come back. And the only way to get better at writing is to do it over and over and over. If you have an opportunity to practice writing in any context, take it. So if you're in a meeting and someone needs somebody to take notes for everyone else, volunteer. If you have questions about something and you're usually the type of person who picks up a phone, well, try writing it in a succinct email instead. These kinds of activities, while we sometimes avoid them, are low stakes writing. You're not getting graded for this writing. You're just practicing the art of putting together your thoughts, editing, revising, proofing, and sharing for an audience, right? You're giving this to someone else to read. Practice, and you will begin to feel more confident about that writing, and you will start to see your own improvement. If you send an email and you don't get 50 questions in response, maybe that email was succinct. That's a good sign. As you're writing, also, don't forget to ask for help from a tutor. So we're Tutor.com. So of course, I'm just going to say this super quickly. We have tutoring for essay writing, and our tutors can help you all throughout the process when you're just clarifying that assignment direction. What are they asking me to do? When you have a rough draft and you want someone to tell you if your ideas are on the right track, or when you're looking to just polish it up. Tutoring can help you gain confidence too. So I hope you'll think about trying that, which is this quote. I love it. It's truly a quote from a student who said, "Thank you so much for your review. I appreciate the time you took to read over my document. Your feedback really boosted my confidence in submitting my assignment. Thank you." It's always better to have someone else read your assignment before, maybe your instructor. So here are just a few links. Most of this came out of my own head and experience, but I did do some research on this. Up next, overcoming test anxiety is the next one I'll be doing. All kinds of test anxiety. And then the last one, which I've said many times is coming, is critical thinking and research skills on November 3rd. So just wanted to point those out. And then I'm getting ready now to pass it back to Jess, who might have some questions in the Q&A that I would love to answer.
All right, thanks, Amy. We do have a couple of questions. First came in when you were talking about choosing your language and the words that you use in your paper appropriately. That question was, what is the difference between use and utilize?
Good question. Well, if you were to look up the definitions for both, they're probably very, very similar. But if you were to plug those words into a sentence, you might notice just a slight difference in how the sentence feels and what you really are conveying in that sentence. So that's really what I mean by that. I don't know that I could give you this has a totally different definition. But when you start to play around with your vocabulary in your sentences, you'll start to see that it is the clarity that comes from making word choices a little bit different. Is really significant, and it makes also sometimes it just sound a little bit better. See, utilize sounds to me a little bit more advanced than use. So that's where you want to try these kinds of things. But a lot of times the thesaurus or the dictionary is going to say the words are the same, but we know that there's nuances to words. They're not always the same.
All right, thank you, Amy.
Sure.
Next question was, how do I cite an author in back-to-back sentences?
Great.
Sometimes I want to combine the sentences, but it doesn't always make for the best writing. Should I just cite the author in back-to-back sentences?
Great. Okay, there's a couple ways you can do this. Generally, rule of thumb. Now, I'm not your instructor, so your instructor may have a different way of doing this, but generally, if you have 2 or 3 sentences all in a row that are from the same author, you can generally just cite that author at the end of that 3rd sentence or that 2nd sentence. And that is telling the reader that all that information came from that same place. Another thing you can do is you can start one of the sentences with Dietzman said, and then write it out. And then the next sentence, just write out the information and then cite it at the end of that. So now you're doing it in 2 different ways. It helps it flow a little bit better. So Dietzman said, and then blah, 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 blah. And then the next sentence, and then in quotes in your parenthetical documentation, you would put Dietzman and the page or the year, whatever, however you are supposed to cite, whether it's MLA or APA or whatever. So I hope that helps so that you can kind of switch up the sentence structure, and that'll help it also. But generally, as a rule of thumb, 2 or 3 sentences in a row can go together with 1 citation.
Great, and that actually helped 2 people out with
Yay
questions. All right, next we have, does having good speech also make a good writer? Because I have speech difficulty, I can say certain words, but others are hard for me.
Oh, that's a great question. I can relate to that. I am a processor. And so, I mean, answering questions on the fly is really hard for me. I'm a processor, and I, at times, need to write out what I want to say. Like, no secret, I script a lot of what I say here to you guys today, and I've practiced these presentations a lot, so sometimes they flow. But if I didn't script this and I hadn't done it before, I would be a mess. So I need to write, and that helps me to form my thoughts. I have much better vocabulary when I write than when I speak, but I love public speaking. I just have to practice and write and script and all of that. So they go hand in hand, but you do not have to be a great public speaker to be a wonderful writer. In fact, so many writers are extremely, extremely introverted and don't like to be interviewed about their writing and things like that. So don't feel like you can't be a wonderful writer because you struggle a little bit with speech.
Awesome. Next, we have, what are some good practices for reducing wordiness?
Oh, excellent. One of the questions I like to ask when I'm reading someone's paper, I'm editing someone's paper, is, could I have gotten to this point faster? Does this verbiage here help me understand anymore? Is it adding to my point? Is it distracting? Those kinds of questions to ask yourself, I would say, when you're reading out loud is helpful, because oftentimes you're going to trip over your words when there's just too many of them. So that's important. Ask someone to read your paper for you and tell them to specifically look for that. So a tutor is a great option, or a friend, and say, I'm just trying, I feel like I'm wordy. I work with someone who says all the time, she always says to me, I'm so verbose. And so she has me read a lot of what she writes. And my main mission when I read what she writes is to look for that wordiness. And I help her by saying things like, all of these words here are not making your point any better. If I took out this entire section and I just had 4 words in this sentence, would I still get the point? I probably would. Then that means that sentence is way too wordy. So that's another thing you can do, is have someone read it for you. So those are that's my best advice. And I'll keep thinking about that and throw more in there if I can before we cut out of this one.
So this audience is great. We have lots more questions coming in as you're talking.
Oh my gosh. Okay, we'll get to a few more. Hopefully we can. Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so we have what makes a source credible?
Ooh, that's almost a trick question. Sometimes it depends on your subject and what your instructor is asking of you. It's not always like credible just because, but a lot of times it is who's written it. Is that person credible? A lot of times it's how much research that person has done. You know, sometimes you hear about research studies and they only studied 5 people. That research is like, you know, maybe interesting. It maybe leads into more research, but it's not necessarily sometimes saying what they want you to believe it's saying. So sometimes it's how many people have been researched, how long the researcher has been at it, you know, looking at the topic, who it is, where it's located, how it's written. You know, we have to, and I talk about this in critical thinking, we have to look at writing and see if this is trying to persuade me, if it's trying to make me believe something. That's generally not as credible, because you're not just presenting information, but you're trying to persuade, and persuasion is sometimes not credible. That's, you know, obviously in our political climate, which I won't get into politics, but in our political climate, you know, we all have heard things before and thought, oh, is that true? I don't know about that. That sounds like it might be a little swayed one way or the other. That's often the case. So it's a lot of things, and it's a lot of intuition. And then it's a lot of times, if you're not sure, this is another great opportunity to talk to your instructor and ask your instructor, I can't determine whether this is credible. Something's telling me maybe it's not, but I'm not sure what it is. What do you think? And can you help me understand it? And your instructor may be able to explain to you why a specific something is or isn't credible.
Awesome. Next we have, how do you cite and punctuate a direct quote that also ends in a quote?
That's a good one. I am mostly familiar with APA. All of the classes that I have taught are APA. So I only know how APA does it. I'm afraid to say, because if you're not using APA, I could be completely wrong. Generally, it's a single quote inside of a double quote. So now you're saying that I am quoting a quote. That's generally it. And then what you do is in parentheses, you would put the author and the date, or the author and whatever citation style you're supposed to use. So your parenthetical documentation comes after the quotes. But if you are confused about it, or if it's awkward, try paraphrasing. Paraphrasing generally flows better than direct quotes. And I think students a lot of times are afraid to paraphrase. So they think, oh, if I just quote it directly, then it's going to be easier. And what I always say is, don't quote something directly unless it is so profound or so good that it's going to lose its meaning if you were to paraphrase it. So most of the time that means you will paraphrase instead of quoting. So if you paraphrase something, you still cite it. You're still telling me this comes from someone else. I didn't make it up. But now you are getting away from that. Oh no, I'm quoting a quote and a quote, and this is all confusing, and it may be convoluted, if that's helpful.
All right, how many more can we answer?
Let's do 3 more.
3 more. Okay. Let's see. This is a good one, because it's a question I kind of had too.
Ooh, okay.
Jeff asked, how do I get better at rereading my document? Once I'm done, it's done. And the question I kind of also had throughout this was, for me, like, I hate rereading my writing. Kind of feels like that cringy listening to the recording of your own voice kind of thing.
Yes.
Did you have any tips for overcoming that?
That's good. I think that's a practice thing. I found when I was studying for my doctorate and I was writing a lot, that I started to like my own writing. I started to get to a point where I was like, dang, that was good. So maybe that's part of it, is practicing to the point where you actually find like, huh, I wrote that. That's nice. That's practice. So I hope you can get to that point in writing. But yes, it can be like cringy. And so I think this is another opportunity to have someone else read it if it's really, really difficult for you. I mean, you have to get used to reading your own writing, period. You have to. It's just part of the process. And it's the only way that you can get better and catch your own mistakes. But also, that brings me back to having a really good friend or a tutor read your writing for you. That might help take off a little bit of that pressure. So few options.
Awesome. All right, thank you, because that answered my question too. All right, 2 more, right?
Okay, yeah, let's do it.
Okay.
This is so fun.
Let's do, what is passive voice? And do you have any tips to avoid passive voice sentence structure?
Oh, this is great. Passive voice is when you're writing as if something is happening to you, instead of being in it. So that I wish I had a better, I'm not an English teacher anymore. I need to think of my better example of that. But the best tip to avoid, I think a lot of times this comes naturally for writers to write in passive voice. It's just the way they write. So it's really, really good to, again, have an editor, have someone read it for you and point it out to you, and then teach you how to restructure that. And the more you do it, the more you see the mistake, restructure, learn how to flip it to be that you're in the action instead of passive to the action, then the easier it's going to be. It's just practicing. It really is. It's just practicing, especially if you haven't written a lot in a long time and then you start writing papers. I notice that's what a lot of new students do, because it's just like, oh, I haven't been a writer, and now all of a sudden I'm doing this, making this mistake. I just need someone to point it out to me and tell me how to fix it, and then I'll fix it. So that's part of what it takes is practice.
Awesome. And there's so many good ones. I'm so sorry if we don't get to your question.
And sorry, I didn't have better example about passive. It's like I need an actual sentence example to point it out, but that's okay. Let's keep going. One more.
All right, last one, kind of along the note of the last 2, talking about peer reviewing. The question is, when one is revising or peer reviewing, what are a few things they should look for in their writing or the other person's writing that they're reading? Because I know many see writing as art that could be writing different.
So, okay. So this person is asking for, what should you be looking for if you're helping someone else, if you're peer reviewing someone else's paper?
Yeah.
Okay. Ooh, that's a good one. It's true that it can be art, and some people can get very offended if someone is harsh with what they're writing. So peer reviewing, just like anybody reviewing a paper, should always find positives and not just negatives. So whenever you're reading someone else's paper, always comment on the things that they're doing well. Don't be too critical. The other thing is to make sure that you are not just focusing on grammar and mechanics, because if the person wants you to do that and they say, please just, I have a lot of issues with spelling and punctuation, can you just look at that for me? Then that's great. But if possible, you want to focus on the higher order concerns, is what we call them. So the big picture, is there alignment between the person's thesis statement and the rest of their paper? Does it make sense? Does it flow? Do you understand when you start the paper and you finish the paper? Did they get you there? Did every paragraph lead up to something? Those kinds of things are way more helpful to writers than just like, oh, you forgot your comma here, or you need a period, or don't forget to capitalize. Unless like I said, that's all they want. So I would focus on the big stuff, give them positive reinforcement and positive feedback mixed in with those suggestions. That will be much better to keep a friendship going.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Amy. This was very informative. Again, I apologize if we didn't get to your question, but thank you everyone for joining us. And again, you'll get a recording of this session after this, and some links to register for those upcoming sessions, like Amy's on critical thinking and sources.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody.